Hello, welcome to Primitive Types and Strings. The things that I'll be going over today include what primitive types are and strings. These are two essential parts of Java. So, before we dive into primitive types, let's review something from earlier in the course. We went over variables and how variables are simple and that they store values, but we also went over that each variable has a type, whether it be a number, text, or a true or false value. And primitive types are those types that the variable has. And primitive types are also known as built-in types. And there are 8 total primitive types: int, double, boolean, char, byte, short, long, and float. Now, out of these 8 primitive types, the 3 most important primitive types are int, double, and boolean in the bold font. And they're the only ones that will be tested on for the AP Computer Science test. So we'll be focusing on them mostly. A lot of these other types are for single characters or larger numbers, but these are the main ones and we're going to focus on them. So without further ado, let's find out more about int, double, and boolean. So int stands for integer, and it's just like the integer we have in math. It can be positive or negative, whole number. And some examples of it are 2, negative 600, 543, and negative 2. So it does have a little bit of restrictions, which means that it can go from negative 2,147,483,648 to the same thing on the positive end, and this is approximately 2 to the 32nd power, but these are really large numbers, and that's where the other type kicks in. So if you're smaller than the limit or larger than the limit, if you're not within the limit, you would use some of these different types for your variable. So if your variable value is too big or too small, then you would use some of the other different types. But that's not very common because, as you can see, it's a pretty big range. And some of the things that you can use with integer are amount, total, or anything like that. Any whole number, it can be negative or positive. So double stands for a double, which is a double precision floating point number. Now that sounds really complicated, and let's look at it simply instead. A double type is just like an integer, but the only important difference is that it can have points after the decimal, which is a common situation, and that's the only difference. So often with integers, it's only a whole number that's negative or positive, but the thing is you can't have anything after the decimal point, but in a double, that gives you that ability. So some of the examples of a double would be 2.23, negative 3.567, negative 123.23, 345.545. These are just some examples. It's similar to an integer, but you could have points, numbers, digits after the decimal. And double type variables can be used to represent the price, the weight, the height, anything that could potentially have a decimal in it. And one important thing to know is that a double can be a whole number as well. So a double can be 2, just 2. It can be 2.23, but it can also just be 2. So it can have decimal points after it, but it's not required that it does. So next up is the Boolean type, which is one of the simpler types. Actually, most of them are, but this is another one of the simpler ones. And it can only have 2 values, true or false, so it is really simple. And there are not many examples of a Boolean type value because it can either be true or false. It's usually used for yes or no questions, so it can answer questions like, is car working, are you happy? And you can have a variable. Basically what you do is you have a variable of Boolean type that tells you if the car is working. So if the car is working, it'll say true, and if it's not working, it'll say false. So that's where Boolean types are used. Now last, let's take a look at the string, which is actually not a primitive type. We'll go into more detail about what it is later in the course, but right now it's just important to know that it's not a primitive type, and it's just a set of characters, basically text, that's what we can consider it to be, and it's enclosed by double quotes to represent it's a string. And now let's think back to the Hello World program, which printed out hello world. And if you remember, it printed out hello world, and in the code, hello world was colored red and it was enclosed by double quotes. Because it was enclosed by double quotes, we were able to determine that it was a string, and it was Dr. Java decided to color it red to indicate that it was a string. Now, the essential question that comes up is, how do we indicate what type of variable is and what its value is? And we'll be covering that shortly in something known as variable declarations. And primitive types and strings are a central part of Java, and it's really, really important to have a good understanding of them. And as long as you comprehend all the topics I've gone over, you should. Thank you for watching.